I'm a retired Chief Superintendent of Police from, as the big badge says, South Yorkshire. Somebody said, why is it such a big badge? Well, I worked for them a long time, but on the sort of legal things is, any opinion I give today is my personal opinion. It's not that of South Yorkshire Police, because they pay my pension quite regularly at the moment. And also, it's not the opinion of Silver Seas or any other organisation. I appreciate from last night, there's a fair amount of passengers from America. I hope I don't confuse you with our common language, but I will try occasionally to put the American equivalent in. But it did set me thinking, what's the Chief Superintendent in American Police Force? And I don't know. I'm Chief Superintendent in the UK is one down from the Chiefs of Police. You'd have a Chief Constable, a Deputy and an Assistant Chief, and then a Chief Superintendent. So to give an idea, I'd be in charge of a large geographic area, which I'll touch on in a minute. So that was my rank in the police. I do tend to walk about a bit. I can't stand behind the lectern, so apologies again if the mic goes away. So I've spoken in a number of audiences, obviously cruise ships, but actually I've spoken Scotland Yard, the Staff College for the police in England, in Scotland, in Ireland. I did some work in the Netherlands. So I do try and add an element of internationalism to it, but I follow very much the mission statement of the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, and that's to inform, to educate, and importantly to entertain. So I hope during the next 45 minutes, in order to perhaps make my other talks even more effective, is I'm going to get over some of the basics of detecting a crime. But I thought you're quite an intelligent audience, and I could have started off dealing with things like theft, but I think we need to go in at the top. So I'm going to deal with murder this afternoon, because I think you're capable of doing that. So let's just go on to see this very dapper young officer on the right-hand side there, and that was me just before I retired as a Chief Superintendent. It's not me that's very short, but Paul, the constable that I'm with, is actually 6'10", and that's not including his helmet. Seriously, and it's actually a disadvantage to be tall, because on my very first day of walking the beat, and in those days we did used to walk the beat, and I put the helmet on, which is 10 inches, I went upstairs on a double-decker bus. You know, in England we have double-decker buses, and of course there's nobody who told me to take the helmet off when you go to the top of a double-decker bus. So there's a little crown on the top, and I dented that, and I also dented the roof of the bus. For those that are attention for detail, it was the number 24 that went from Totley to Tinsley in Sheffield every 15 minutes. You'll notice that I've got a moustache. That's because as a young police constable at the age of 19, I went in a public house, a bar, with my sergeant, and the landlord called the sergeant across and said, would you like an orange juice for your young boy? So he took me outside and suggested that I grow a moustache. And 23 years later, my late wife said, do you want to shave your moustache off? You look old. So I took it off. Would you believe observation skills? Nobody at my police station noticed for 2 weeks that I'd got rid of the moustache, so it doesn't say a great deal, that does it? So a bit about me. So I did say I'm from, well, the badge said South Yorkshire. South Yorkshire's in the middle of England, sort of, but some say it's in the north. But if you make the UK and add Scotland, it is really in the middle. Population of about 1.5 million. In my last geographic command, I had something like 250,000 population, and I had something in the region of about 300 police officers to patrol that. And Sheffield is known in the past for its steel production and for its cutlery. So that gives you a background, a very industrial area. We had coal mining till probably the late 80s, and most of the coal mines disappeared. So we've got a very, very working class background, but we're surrounded by some incredible countryside. So we had a mix of city centres and town centres, and also a lot of rural stuff as well. So that's a bit about me. The next presentations will add a little bit more. And I did a number of jobs. I was a detective. I was a firearms commander. I was a public order commander. And again, Americanism, I also was in charge of the county's road policing department, Highway Patrol, but we don't have a separate department. It actually belongs to the local police force. So I ran Highway Patrol for a while in South Yorkshire. You've actually started your training because I've supposedly got 45 minutes to convert you into detectives. But for some of you that recognise the TV programmes, and you will have your own equivalents in America, Australia, you were probably very, very good at dealing with crime. But you've got an hour or 45 minutes when you're doing it on the TV. Some of you won't recognise those. The one on the top there is any British, Dixon of Dock Green from the 1960s. When I joined the police, my parents thought I was going to be like Dixon, which was a traditional British police officer. I didn't want to be like Dixon at all. I wanted to be like the people in the top. Sorry, he said, going back, pressing the wrong button. I wanted to be like the people in the top, the Sweeney, the flying squad in the Met. That's what I wanted to be like. But actually, one of my favourite programmes for the American or British audience was Hill Street Blues. And I thought, fantastic, let's be careful out there. But actually, TV, I don't know if anybody recognises that guy there. Taggart, it's a murder. Is actually Mark McManus, the actor, and this is from a colleague in Scotland. He used to hang around the bars in Glasgow where police officers went for a drink to pick up on the jargon and the skills. But actually, after a period of time, he started to offer his opinion on how they should solve the crime, and they did explain when he did it, he had a script. What we also get in the UK, and I guess you have the same, and chatting to somebody this morning who lives in America, they said they do have the factual. We have one called 24 Hours in Police Custody, which is a fly on the wall looking at real crime. And something I'm going to come back to, because it's relevant not just to today's presentation, but to one I do on Friday, is we get drama documentaries where TV producers take actual facts of a real case, dramatise it, and they tend to be very, very good. The Long Shadow is about somebody called the Yorkshire Ripper, which I'll touch on today, but I'll develop on Friday in more detail. A serial killer that stalked the streets of the north of England for about 6 years in the late 70s and early 80s, and I've got intimate knowledge of that investigation. So that if you've had your training, you've no excuse, because I forgot to mention there is an exam at the end. Okay, so practical exam on dealing with a real murder, one that took place. I don't mean we're going to have one this afternoon, but... Right, the basic elements of a crime. And this applies whether it's a theft, but so we're dealing with murders. We need a crime to start with. It's useful if we know the motive, because if you can find out what the motive is for the crime, it might help you identify who's done it. Okay, you don't have to have the motive when you take the case to court, but we're on about detecting it. We'll have the court case next week. You need a victim, generally, but we'll make some exceptions to that. And you need a suspect. Well, why have I said you need a crime? Well, that's obvious. Well, not necessarily. Because it doesn't include accidents. And I'm going to put 3 cases up. That young lady there is Nicola Bully. And Nicola disappeared in January 23. Nicola dropped her kids off at school. She was an real estate agent. She went to a park, took a dog for a walk in the park, got on the phone, conference call, and after a few minutes, the phone went dead. And then a short time later, people found the dog running about on the riverbank, hadn't been in the water. Nicola had disappeared. Massive search for Nicola. What it generated was a massive, massive interest on the internet, probably because it was slow news week, it was just after Christmas. People from America saying she'd been murdered. Her husband had done it. It was quite obvious. Her husband was very quickly alibied out because they'd got things like Ring cameras and Ring doorbell cameras. He was alibied, he was at home. Even an expert turned up with underwater search equipment and said, I will find her if she's in this river. She's obviously not if she's not in the river, she's been murdered and taken away. The actual police officers on the scene, and I was talking, as this was happening, I was talking to ex-colleagues, and they were saying, well, it's quite obvious what happened. She's probably gone to get the dog. The dog's moved out of the way, and she's gone headed in over heels into the water. It's freezing cold water shock. She's probably dead. The world wouldn't accept that. It was explained that after there was a massive press conference, there was a very competent woman detective superintendent put in charge of the inquiry. She got criticism for her dress sense, what she was wearing at the TV. People were saying, why, I can't believe it, why would you wear that dress to do nonsense? The police officers, we have an office or a role in the police called a POLSA. It's a police licensed search advisor. They have to do a lot of training. And they said, we think she's in the river. When the body starts to decompose, it'll sunk to start with. As the body starts to decompose, there'll be gases, and she'll come back to the surface, and they reckon on about 7 to 10 days. And the world on the media wouldn't accept that. It became a circus, felt sorry for the family, and guess what? 7 to 10 days later, sadly, Nicola floated to the surface, and it was an accident. but people wanted a murder. They didn't want an accident. So nice thing is the woman detective superintendent with the bad dress sense went and sat with the body for 4 hours until the body was recovered, because she thought that was her role. It didn't matter what she was wearing at the time. There was an incident at a seaside resort called Bournemouth on the south of England, where sadly 2 youngsters drowned. There was rioting on the beach that night because they'd been murdered by a boat operator. They hadn't, they'd got caught in a riptide. People don't want an accident, they want a murder. And finally, I don't know if we've got any ice hockey fans in. In October 2023, Adam Johnson, who played for Nottingham Panthers, was playing in Sheffield, and sadly he got his throat cut with an opponent player's blade. And it's outrageous, but that player is still on bail. They haven't decided whether they're going to prosecute him or not for manslaughter. It's ridiculous. And that's down to the Crown Prosecution Service in England. You have a guy there whose life has been put on hold. A tragic accident. The blade cut his main artery. Actually, I know the paramedic that went to it, and when they arrived at the ice, there was no way he could be saved. And I think it's outrageous that society sometimes wants a murder when it's an accident. So I would hope that the player for Sheffield in due course will be released from bail and it won't be a case. So crime, motive, victim, suspect. Okay, we've got that. So why do people commit murder then? Talk about motive. Sometimes it's random. It's pure chance. There's a case quite recently in Nottingham where a guy that hadn't been taking his meds, seriously psychologically damaged, and he killed 2 students on the way home after a night out, and a school caretaker. They were in, and I hate to say it, but they were in the wrong place at the wrong time as far as he was concerned. He shouldn't have been out on the street, but he was. Drink, drugs, either people under the influence of it, or increasingly we see in England, drugs as a precursor that actually people involved in selling drugs, so drugs can be a major problem. Mental health, which I touched on slightly, but we do get people, we call it care in the community, and it's when people, sadly, there is no place for them in a mental home or mental hospital, or they try and manage them in the community, and people who are mentally unstable go and kill somebody. Sadly, we get domestics and involve also sexual offences that people get killed during those. And actually, during robberies, decreasingly so, but people get killed in the process of crime. We used to call it the 4 L's, love, lust, loot and loathing, might be the motive when you get a murder. I said being in the wrong place at the wrong time. That guy's Chris, I'm not going to give his surname, I try not to sometimes, because it's still an active case. We call it Boxing Day, you just call it day to go back to work after Christmas, I understand that if you're from America. 26th of December, 2023, Chris was out for a walk with his wife and kids, and they saw a young lady laying on the footpath, and she'd been involved in a fight. 2 families were having an argument. Chris went across to see if she was all right, as did an off-duty nurse went across, and at which point a car came racing round the corner, and it was her brother-in-law, and he raced across the footpath, and he killed Chris, and he seriously injured the nurse. That case is still pending. The driver's been charged with murder. The jury couldn't make their mind up about 3 months ago. It was a hung jury, and that's going back for trial. They were trying to say it was a more serious road policing offence of causing death by, or his defence, causing death by dangerous driving. Prosecution said it's murder. The jury's got to decide on that one. But that, again, wrong place at wrong time, Good Samaritan. So, motives. I don't expect, probably other than the British audience, to know these, but these are 3 serial killers from the UK. Started left to right. Anybody? Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper. I'm going to focus on that in a lot of detail on Friday, but Peter Sutcliffe, when I was a young detective in the 70s and 80s, we'd get what's called elimination inquiries, where Peter Sutcliffe murdered at least, he was charged with 13 murders and 7 attempts, but murdered a lot more women than that. He would stalk the streets of cities like Leeds and Sheffield and Bradford, and he would take women off the street and he would brutally murder them. Not necessarily sexually assault them, there's some question about that, but he would brutally murder them. He would stab them with a Phillips screwdriver, he would hit them over the head with a hammer, and he would leave them in the street to be found. Some of them were sex workers, some of them weren't sex workers, but he was a horrible man. As detectives, you can't have confirmational bias. And West Yorkshire Police, and it was the West Yorkshire Police of the day, not West Yorkshire Police today, that was the force just above my force. The senior investigating officer received a hoax tape, although he didn't know it was a hoax when he got it, with somebody with an accent from the very north of England, in Northumbria. They're called Geordies, and it's a very pronounced accent. And he said, I'm the Yorkshire Ripper, I've murdered these women, and you can't catch me, can you? So he got the very pronounced accent. Result of which that was driven through the inquiry. And if I went and saw a suspect, and that was due to registration plates of cars being seen in certain areas, the first question that West Yorkshire Police would ask, has he got a Geordie accent? And if you said no, they said, well, it'll not be him then. Sent paperwork through, but it'll not be him. So I'll come back to that, develop it more. They made a mistake because Sutcliffe didn't have a Geordie accent. He actually lived in West Yorkshire. But they drove their inquiry. The killer's got to have a Geordie accent. So the guy in the middle, that's Harold Shipman. I don't give him his full title because that's all the time, but I'll do it this once. That's Dr. Harold Shipman. And Harold Shipman murdered at least 218 of his patients. He was a GP, we call him GP, just the local doctor that you'd go and see with minor ailments. And when he decided that it was time for somebody to die, he would go and give them an overdose of a particular drug and they would die. And it was only one lady who was a lawyer, when she saw a mum's will that had been altered by him, as a bit amateurish actually, that the inquiry was started. And they got as far as 218 victims, probably a lot more. But Harold had the last laugh on everybody because he managed to get life insurance without a suicide clause in it. And so when he was dealt with at court, he was sent to prison and he committed suicide a couple of days before his 60th birthday, and his widow got all the money. So he had the last laugh on everybody. But a horrible man, very arrogant. He was interviewed by a detective constable, a detective sergeant, and he said, but I'm a doctor. It should be at least a detective chief inspector interviewing me because of my status. But he never got to serve his sentence. Final one, and at the right-hand side, anybody know? Nielsen, Dennis Nielsen. Not David Tennant, the actor that played him in a TV series about the killer, who looked very much like him. Got a bit of story linked to Nielsen. I'll tell you about his death, killing in a minute. Nielsen, so I dealt with shoplifting, theft from a shop. And as a young detective, I dealt with a guy on a Saturday afternoon, which is relevant because the guy was homeless, and he made it obvious that he was stealing in the shop. Stole a leg of lamb and sort of wanted to get caught because he was homeless, and he knew if he was arrested, he'd get free board and lodgings Saturday and Sunday night in the police station before court on the Monday morning. So I dealt with him, parked that for a while, okay, because a few years later, I got a telephone call, and it was from Scotland Yard in London. And they said, you dealt with this guy 3-4 years ago, and when you arrest somebody, as well as taking photograph and fingerprints and DNA samples, you'll do a descriptive form. Even if you arrest them 3 times in 1 week, tattoos, marks and scars, you describe them. And I said, yeah, I seem to remember it now you say, the lad from Scotland, yeah. He said, yeah, why? He said, well, we've found his arm. What, just his arm? And they said, yeah, just his arm. Because it was in that cooking pot just there. And Nielsen would befriend young lads that were homeless, that were living on the streets, and he would take them back to his flat in London, where he would drug them or strangle them, and then he would bathe them, clean them up, then dress them again, and keep them in the flat for a few days for company. Then he would chop them up, and he would bury them in the garden. And his big downfall was he put a body part down the toilet, and he didn't have one of those signs, put it in the bin, he put it down the toilet, he blocked the toilet, they called Dynarod, and they found the body part, and the rest is history. So it was the guy that I dealt with, he'd done that. I actually, when I left the police, I worked for a company called Tracker. In America, it's LoJack. I was the UK police advisor, and we had a charity dinner at Scotland Yard. And that cooker, because that is the cooker from Nielsen's flat, is in a place called the Crime Museum at Scotland Yard. Not open to the public, it's only open to police officers and guests at Scotland Yard. And I stood at the back because I've been to the Crime Museum before and seen it. And the guy who was a retired cop showed them round, and he explains that's Nielsen's cooker. And as we're going out, I told him that story, and he stopped and paused, and he goes, I was the detective that you spoke to. It was my job to identify the body. So small world, years later. So there are 3 serial killers. Motives, Sutcliffe said it was to rid the world of sex workers. He was just an evil man, and had been an evil man since he'd been a teenager. He'd murdered a lot more than he was ever convicted. Harold Shipman, he thought he was God, and he decided when people were going to die. And Nielsen, they never really worked out. Nielsen was very clever, and they never really worked out what his motive was. I don't think it was lonely. He was just, again, just an evil man. So that's got motives. That's when it's a bit different. What I want to do is separate how we deal with jobs. Pre-80s, because it was a watershed, and I'm guessing not just for England, UK, I would guess for around the world. I'll just very briefly go through some of the methods for detecting. That forensics, it's quite appropriate that we're in China, because the first evidence of forensics being used to solve a crime was in 1235 in China, when somebody was killed in a paddy field, and they believe, well, they were right, the person had been killed with a rice sickle. And they obviously used for chopping the rice. Body was found, and the local magistrate asked all the men in the village, it's a true story, I'm not making it up, to parade in the centre of the village with their sickles. And they got them to stand there for half an hour, and guess which sickle had got all the blowflies on it? It was the sickle that had been used in the murders. Despite the fact they'd tried to clean the sickle, the blowflies found the blood, and the guy did admit to being the murderer. So they're one of the first examples of forensic entomology using insects, which can be very, very useful in solving crime. The first forensic school was opened in Paris in 1910, and Edmund Lockhart, who was one of the first students to graduate from there, came up with a well-worn phrase that is still used today: for every contact, there is a trace. And that's, if you go and grab somebody, hold them, touch them, fibres will be transferred from clothes. If in the boot of a car, you might see police with sellotape actually put it over somebody's, perhaps a body, putting it over their leg to see if there's any materials being transferred to their body parts. It still applies today. For every contact, there is a trace. 1910 that came out in France. Forensics of other form developed, and I'll talk about DNA and other examples, but that's the early parts of forensic. Going across interview at the top, not very successful in the 80s. It became discredited. Defendants would say the police have made it up. There was no video recording. There was no tape recording. We don't have lie detectors in the UK. I appreciate having America. But lie detectors go back many, many centuries. And one of the ones used in India, if they had a suspect in, they would give them a handful of dry rice, put it in the mouth. It was the suspect's job to spit the rice out. If it left any rice in the mouth, they were guilty. Another one that was used in the Middle East, they got a red hot piece of metal. They were told to touch it with the tongue, and if it burnt the tongue, they were guilty. So they're probably not as reliable as methods we've got today. But interview skills and interview techniques have improved tremendously. Fingerprints, what do we think about fingerprints? They're reliable. First used to detect a murder in Argentina in 1892. First used in England to detect a murder in 1901, and USA in 1910. In England, they're developed by Darwin's relative, well, actually, I would have said at one time they are pretty reliable. But there's a female police officer in Scotland, when she got arrested for perjury, because she'd been accused of being in a murder scene and leaving her fingerprint. When you join the police, they take your fingerprints for elimination purposes. Her fingerprints were found at the scene of a murder. She said, I haven't been in the house. I went near the house. They called her as a witness to court. She gave that evidence in court because the convicted person had been detected on his fingerprints. She said, I haven't been in the house. 2 days after the court case, she was arrested, charged with perjury, which is lying under oath, taken to court. They called American fingerprint experts in that said, it's not her prints. They then sacked the Scottish fingerprint expert who'd said it was her, the police officer's fingerprints. She then took the Scottish Police Service to court for unfair dismissal and got paid a lot of money. So not a very good job, but fingerprints rely on expert evidence. They now search by computer, but experts will look up at the end. So it's important that experts do their job. ID parades, ID evidence, reliable? Not really. I used to run the ID parades where we get a witness in. We used to have 12 people lined up. So now they're on computer. In UK, it's called Viper, where there are thousands of options and the suspect can pick where they want to sit or stand in the lineup, electronic lineup. The eyes are not a video camera and the brain's not a computer. And what you find is, with witnesses, they think they know what they've seen, and the brain records what they want to record. And when it's regurgitated in a statement to the police, it's diluted. Another Scottish, I'm not picking on the Scottish, but there was a Scottish case again a few years ago where a guy called William Mills was charged and got sent to prison for robbery in a bank, in the Royal Bank of Scotland in Glasgow. He was picked out on video camera. A couple of police officers saw the video. It circulated, and they said, well, that's William Mills, that. Witnesses saw the tape. They said it's William Mills. He went to court. The jury said it's William Mills, until they found an item of clothing after he'd been convicted that had been discarded by the real robber, and it wasn't William Mills. DNA proved it wasn't William Mills, as he'd been saying all along. So ID evidence is always questionable. You had the very sad case in London of Jean-Charles Domenez, who was thought to be a terrorist, and the police shot him on the underground system. It's bad ID, so it's always questionable. I'll finish off with ID. We're talking about photo fits. Who's the real one? Who's the drawing? I was always very sceptical about photo fits. We have an actor in England called Bob Hoskins. Somebody might have seen him a few years ago, a well-known actor. I dealt with what's called a bogus official robbery, where an old lady, somebody came into her house, stole a lot of property, and she gave a photo fit. We got the experts out who did the drawing, all done on computer now, and it looked like Bob Hoskins, the actor. And we said, she's probably seen Bob Hoskins on the TV the night before, and actually she's remembered that. Until 2 weeks later, and the real suspect was arrested on a train, and he looked like Bob Hoskins. So actually, it encouraged me that photo fits can be okay. So that's pre-80s. That's what we'd got in the toolbox, pre-80s. And very questionable. And people were starting to... there were a lot of cases in England where people on appeal got away with it because the evidence didn't convince the appeal court that they were guilty. I'm going to talk about a real case in Sheffield now where that old technology did actually help. I don't normally give full names, but this one received national coverage, and it's well known within the area. That's the Leitner family. Starting left, that's Basil, who was a well-known lawyer in Sheffield. That's his daughter Nicola, that's in the pattern dress. That's Suzanne in a wedding dress. That's the day of Suzanne's wedding. That's Robert, who was training to be a barrister, a lawyer in England. And that's Avril, Mrs. Leitner, and she was a well-known doctor in Sheffield. They were brutally murdered on the night of the wedding. Suzanne and her new husband had gone off on honeymoon, and Nicola, and again, I'm not giving away any confidentiality because it was published. Nicola was seriously sexually assaulted. She wasn't murdered, but the Leitners, it was one of the first murders that we used video evidence at the scene. I have never seen brutality. They were killed with a knife, and it was awful how they were murdered. So Sunday night, Monday morning, people, they don't turn up for work. People start making inquiries. They go to their very, very palatial home in Sheffield. It's in an area called Dore. I don't expect you to know that, in Abbeydale. Very, very nice area of Sheffield. Very, very big houses there. Where they'd had the marquee. This is not the actual marquee. This is library shots. There were 700 wine glasses and champagne flutes that had to be fingerprinted. And they were fingerprinted. And they got some prints, lots of prints. But imagine the elimination prints they needed for all the guests that had been there. Interestingly, in the fridge in the house, the refrigerator, they found a lump of cheese with a bite mark out of it. The Leitner's household wasn't one where you'd expect a lump of cheese to be in the fridge with a bite mark out of it, but there was then, which brought in forensic odontology to look at the bite mark to see who it might be. And Nicola gave an incredible description of the man that had raped her and actually assaulted her or murdered her parents. And it was this guy, Arthur Hutchinson's, who she described his unbelievable piercing eyes. My late wife happened to be at the police station when he was arrested after being on the run for 4 or 5 weeks, and she was some distance from him, and she said, the thing I remember most is about his eyes, because his eyes were unbelievable from the far side. He actually used to play on that. He escaped from a police station in North Yorkshire. He was on remand for rape and burglary, And the police station was under renovation, and he said, can I go to the toilet? And guess who went through the toilet window? He was on the run, and he committed that most horrendous murder. He holds a bit of a record, actually, in the criminal justice system in England. The judge, knowing that he'd found guilty by, pleaded not guilty, a long trial at Sheffield Crown Court, he got 17 years for that crime. The Home Secretary, government minister, took the case and said life imprisonment. Arthur Hutchinson took that through every appeal possible for 25 years until eventually the European Court said, no, the Home Secretary can sentence you to life. I'm gobsmacked that the judge gave him 17 years for killing 3 people and raping somebody else. We scratched our heads, we couldn't understand. So that's the old technology actually delivering the goods. So I haven't said it's rubbish, so think about it. When we get the exam at the end, it might come in handy. There's no odontology cheese involved in the test at the end. We had a TV programme in the 80s called Life on Mars, and that showed old-style policing. And actually, you'll find cops talking about the Life on Mars era, before all the rules and regulations, because what came out in the mid-80s was a piece of legislation in the UK called the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, which is cops and lawyers will talk about PACE. That changed everything. It codified the detention and treatment of suspects in the police station. There was no time limit before that. It brought in a time limit. For most offences, the maximum time you can hold anybody is 24 hours, hence the programme, 24 hours in custody. That can be extended to 96 hours for serious offences. It explains that somebody in custody in a police station's got to have 8 hours rest period if they're there for 24 hours. When they get a meal, right and access to a solicitor, to a lawyer, that wasn't necessarily the case before the 1980s. The legislation is massive, and it actually appointed specific roles within the police called custody sergeants, and it's their job to make sure that the suspects, once they're in custody, get all their rights. So police officers in the 80s were scratching their heads thinking, well, we're going to get made redundant here. We'll not be able to solve everything because everything's gone down the pan. We can't police under these regulations. However, somebody in Leicestershire, a detective chief inspector by the name of Dave Baker, was looking at a double murder that he'd got where 2 young girls had been, over a 3-year period, Dawn Ashworth and Linda Mann, teenage girls, were murdered, sexually assaulted and murdered. And he was a good detective chief inspector, got his ears to his ground, and he found out that there was a scientist at Leicester University working on a thing called DNA. And Alec Jeffreys was the scientist, became Sir Alec Jeffreys. And he went to see him and he said, I understand you're working on something to do with DNA. He says, yeah, but it's not to do with crime. It's to do with paternity cases and immigration cases. He said, any chance it could help me solve a murder? Because we've actually got a young lad in custody that's got learning difficulties, but I don't think he's done it. He's saying he's done it. I don't think he has. So he actually got funding from his chief to actually use DNA for the first occasion ever in the world. And he took a real risk because some of the chiefs said, it ain't going to work. This is not going to work. And it didn't work because they got funding for 5,500 samples to be taken. And they drew a big circle around where the girls had been found dead. And they tested everybody of men between a certain age. And that's Colin Pitchfork who actually committed the murder, and they didn't find him. Because what Colin did, he paid his mate £200 to go and be him. And he got his passport, and it was in the days when it was really a stick-on photograph, not a printed photograph. And they very carefully took Colin's picture off and stuck his friend's picture on, and he went and gave the DNA sample. But the big mistake was his friend had too much to drink a couple of months later in a pub, and he said, you never guess how I earned £200? And somebody heard it, reported it to the police. Interesting, Pitchfork had got over 100 convictions. Again, this is where we go into English, for flashing. That means exposing his genitalia. And he'd done that lots and lots of times. The police now see that as a red flag as far as potential to commit more serious sexual offences. Pitchfork was found guilty of the murder. First time ever DNA was used. The rest is history. UK set its DNA database up in 1995. America followed in 1998. We now get a thing called familial DNA, where sometimes DNA will come up from somebody else. We had a rapist in Rotherham called the Shoe Rapist, because he would take a trophy from each victim and he would keep the shoes at home. He got arrested because his sister got arrested for drink driving with over the prescribed limit of drink, and it was seen that her DNA was similar. I understand in America and certain parts of Scandinavia, they're now using family tree DNA, where people put their DNA samples in to see whether they're related to Henry VIII, and then that's kept in a database, and it's being used. We don't use that in the UK. We just use familial, but it's an area that we might develop into later on. So that's genetics and DNA. I've put the old ones up, some may remember them. Mobile phones came along, we could start to track criminals by their mobile phone usage, by looking at what they say in text. I know people have burner phones, but we can even got technology that we can do that. Computers, one of the early ones, we can start looking computer to see what they've done. People do actually sometimes put into the computer a search, how to commit the perfect murder, so when the scientists download the information. Lots of information from computers. Computers also came to the service of the police following the Ripper inquiry. And that's Holmes, not named after the detective, but that's Home Office Large Major Inquiry System, where previously inquiries were paper-based and by card. We brought in the UK the first computerised system to analyse the evidence and help to draw patterns, and that is now the standard version of how we investigate murders or serious crimes, and I think we're on version Holmes 3 at the moment. CCTV, something as a young cop, never had it at all, but people have got doorbell cameras, they've got cameras in their homes. We now, if we have a murder inquiry, we'll have a team dedicated collecting CCTV. It takes hundreds and hundreds of hours because somebody's got to watch it when we've collected it as well. And social media, Facebook, TikTok, people will still give evidence and they don't realise that police will download it, they'll seize it. CSI, that's the real CSI. It's a degree course. It used to be something that you could volunteer for, go on a 10-week course. It's now a 3-year degree course. They dress like that because they can't contaminate. Even breathlets of air could deliver DNA. So I do actually, when I see people in the designer clothes walking into the crime scene, you take a bit of a deep breath because it's the people on the left that really do the real job, although they do look very smart, don't they, in CSI. I'm going to talk you through a real job now, and I'm slowing things down a little bit because this is a job. When I was a commander, as a bit of a tradition, I would always be at work the first. So I was the chief super. My detective chief inspector would arrive probably about 7:15. I'd get to work. The DCI would wander in a little bit later. My operations superintendent, another couple of senior officers would arrive. I always made the coffee for them. That was a tradition that I established at my police station. And on this particular morning, there was a young female officer waiting for me. She'd been on the night shift. And I had to smile because I'd known her since she was about that high, because her dad worked with me, and he was subsequently was my wife's sergeant, and it was Lucy Robinson. And Lucy was looking quite tired and quite pained. And she goes, "Oh, we've got a missing person, boss. But I don't think it's a missing person. I'm worried about it." And I said, "Well, Lucy, tell me what it is." And she goes, "Well, let me tell you about Julie." I'm not going to give a surname. This is Julie. She's married. She's got 2 grown-up daughters that are sort of 16, that sort of age group, 14, 15, 16-year-old. She lives with her husband, but it's a bit of an open marriage. And actually, she's got a long-term boyfriend as well. And he's taken her to Leeds, which is 45 minutes drive up the motorway from Sheffield. And their plans were the night before, they was meeting her at tea time, driving up to Leeds. And they were going to a shop called Harvey Nichols, which anybody from the UK will know is a real high-class store. They've got branches in London. Very expensive goods to sell there. And he's going to buy her 2 handbags. She's told us that he's taking her away there to buy 2 handbags, and how much they were going to be. She said, "I'm really pleased." Strange marriage, I know, but this was quite happy. But this is where the kids came in, and the kids were instrumental in this. They said, "Mum sent a text last night and said, 'I'm not coming home, I need some space.' But that's not how my mum would text. She words text differently. And she wouldn't put X's at the end. She doesn't do that." Immediate thoughts was, could it be the husband, with that motive? We're thinking, but the daughters alibied the dad out of it and said, we haven't moved from the house. My dad hasn't been anywhere but here. We're absolutely petrified that something's happened to my mum. She's not like although she goes out with, and let's introduce him, shall we? She goes out with Howard. Howard was a successful businessman. He was from Derbyshire, lived just outside Chesterfield, which is a market town in Derbyshire. He sold industrial gases, acetylene, oxygen to farming and companies, made a lot of money. And so that's what we've got. So 7:30 in the morning, that's what we're faced with. This isn't the exam, this is the practice, all right, well, because the exam's coming in a minute. So have we got a crime? Any thoughts? Thinking about motive, crime, suspect, victim. Well, have we got a victim? Well, have we? Because she might have gone to a mate's house. Might be having a sleepover. So have we got a victim? So, and have we got a crime? She's in her late 30s, early 40s. Stopping out for the night is not a crime. So we've got to make a judgment call here of what we're going to do. So the senior detective, I'll give his name, my detective superintendent, Kevin Hardy, absolutely brilliant detective. We'd been young cops together. He was superb. He says, let's get him in. Let's invite him in to help, the classic one, help with our inquiries. So we invited him in, and he came to the police station quite willingly and didn't say anything. He wouldn't talk to us. So we said, what's happened to Julie? And he wasn't under arrest at this point. He just shrugged his shoulders. Well, but weren't you with her last night? Where's your car? So we need his car, because the car that he took her in, oh, he said, pressing the wrong signal, was a Mercedes sports car. And he wouldn't say where the car was, wouldn't tell us. And somebody said, I wonder if it's fitted with low jack. And this is not why I got the job with them. This is pure coincidence, this. And they said, if it's got a tracker in it, we might be able to find it. So we contacted Tracker, and it had got a tracker in it. And we found the car hidden. And in the footwell of the passenger side was a pool of blood. So at that point, Howard went from that side of the counter to this side of the counter, and he was arrested on suspicion of murder. But it was only suspicion because we haven't got a body. She might actually be at a mate's house. And the only time he ever spoke to us was to say he'd knocked a dog down, and the blood was from a dog. In those days, we needed a lot of, not quite the full pool of blood in the car to get the DNA sample, but we did need a fair amount of blood in those days for DNA. We got DNA. In those days, fast track meant 24 hours, not a couple of hours. But we got the blood sample, we sent it off to the laboratory, and it was Julie's blood. So we haven't got Julie, we've got him, and he just will not cooperate at all. You think by this point we're saying is, we've got blood, you've hidden your car. He didn't want to help us at all, not at all. So we go back to the methods I've included. So we want to know where the car's been and where he's been in the intervening period. Mobile phones, her phone's been turned off, but he forgot to turn his phone on. And we tracked his phone for the early hours of that morning, she'd gone missing, and we tracked it to a farm in Derbyshire, in the middle of the rural countryside of Derbyshire. And there was, we call it a caravan, a mobile home, where there's a young woman living by herself, and I'll give a clue, having murdered Julie, he then went and had sex with the young woman that lived in this caravan, and that's where he'd been. And that he tried to float that as his alibi while I was with her all night. She quickly, when she found out why we were interested, said, well, he didn't arrive till early hours. So what we then start to use is the other technology about, and I didn't mention it earlier on, but we have a system, and I guess you have it in America and other countries, ANPR, automatic number plate recognition. We get about 60 million hits a day in the UK on registration plates that are kept for 2 years. And we can track a vehicle anywhere in the UK from the cameras that are all around cities, on motorways, and fitted to a lot of police vehicles. That's uploaded almost immediately to computers in London. And for 2 years, we can say where that registration plate's been. Obviously, criminals change the plate if they try to, but he didn't change his plate, so we could track his vehicle. And we tracked his sports car that went into his industrial premises in Derbyshire, in Chesterfield. So we knew where that had gone in the early hours. And this is library footage, it's not his. Short time later, coming away from the same premises, also on CCTV in the town centre, was his pickup truck with some big barrels on the back. I know that you're saying, I wonder if Julie could be in one of those barrels. And where do you hide a book if you don't want people to find it? Well, in a library. So we then got the job of finding the barrel. So although the detectives didn't like it, we said, well, you're going to have to get out and start walking round. And we drew a big circle on a map where we worked out the vehicle could have travelled in that period. And we said, we want you to walk round and see if you can find any barrels. And after about 2 weeks, we found the barrel. And we brought it, and we placed it down, and we popped the lid, and Julie was in the barrel. And he went to Crown Court, and he never, ever apologised. He never said anything for the distress and hurt that he caused that family. And he got found guilty of murder. And so that starts to string together all the threads of what we used. But sometimes you need a bit of good luck. Before that, we said, not recognising I've got that slide, DNA has enabled us to do cold case inquiries. I've got to be careful what I tell you about this one because it's actually pending trial now. But in 1986, if you can try and remember what you were doing in 1986, okay, I've got mine in my mind. A young woman was raped in a nightclub called Josephine's in Sheffield. Not in the nightclub, it got an underground car park. And she's married, she's been out with a group of female friends. She went back down to a car park to get in her car, and she was ambushed by a guy who took her in the car and viciously raped her. She got home, told her husband what had happened. He brought her into the police station. They found semen samples on a dress, but we hadn't got DNA available in 1986. It'd just been discovered. When it was discovered, DNA, and we have a system of cold case reviews, I guess you have in America as well, is about every 12 months, 2 years, undetected crimes. They'll look at the exhibits again and see whether, and as DNA is developed, as I said, when it first came in, you needed a pot of blood. It can be a minuscule speck of material now, can DNA. About 2 years ago, the case came up for cold case review, and again, they submitted the samples for DNA, and they put it in the database, and they got a hit from a 71-year-old guy that had been locked up for a minor public order offence with his neighbour, been arrested for arguing with his neighbour and fighting. They'd taken a swab, and he was a suspect. The complication is the lady was dead, the victim had died. I think CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service in the UK, gets a lot of stick. They've decided they're going to prosecute him. So they've interviewed the female officer that took the complaint, the medical examiners that examined the victim is still alive, and the detectives that spoke to her have given statements. They're going to try and prove the job to a jury that the lady that's no longer with us was the victim of a vicious rape. The only thing is we've got a massive backlog of cases in England now, and it's not listed for trial until 2027. The possibility is the guy might be dead by then, but it just shows how cold cases are actually starting to impact. And so you've never, around the world now, with DNA, you're never off the hook. It can get you. But you do need, and I did start to say this, I'd move the position of the slide. Sometimes you need a bit of luck. And any ideas what that might be there? In the car, boot of the car? Oh, what, sorry? Could be a body? Okay, in northern Spain in 2023, a guy went missing from his house in a small town in northern Spain. And a few months later, they found his badly decomposed body on some waste ground. And they thought, who's done this? Start to look for evidence, motive, have we got a crime? And actually, Google Earth came to this help of the detectives that were dealing with it in Spain, because for the first time in 14 years, Google Earth car went down the road just as they were putting the body in the boot of the car. What are the chances of, I mean, I'm not a statistician, but from the AI this morning, I'm sure we'd be able to work out the chances for once in 14 years, the car goes down the road just when they're putting the body in the boot. So you do sometimes rely on a bit of luck. Okay, coming along to help you. Okay, exam time. Remember some of the pointers that I've given. So it's a summer's morning in June in the area of Yorkshire that I police. And it's a beautiful night. And actually, I'm working, so I can tell you it was a gorgeous, warm evening. And we're talking probably about just after midnight. That's the sort of road we're talking about. We didn't get a statement from the Hare because he'd gone by the time we got there, but it's a country road like that. And there's a cottage, little English cottage just up the road. And just after midnight, there's banging and screaming on the door, banging on the door. It's a woman. They've killed my husband. They've killed my husband. The occupier comes down to the door. There's a woman there. She's covered in blood. She's incredibly upset. She said, they've attacked my husband down. He's down the lane. And sure enough, they phoned for the ambulance, for the police service, and there's a guy there that's actually being very, very badly assaulted. I should say this is the area. I mean, unless you're from the area, that's Sheffield, and it's in that area across there, in a place called Thurcroft, a little village called Thurcroft just there. And it's a country lane. And actually, this lady, called Pat, had been out with her husband, Richard, who's in the Merchant Navy, and he's home on leave because he's away a lot working on oil tankers. And they'd come home summer's evening and they'd walk to, again, a typical English country pub, the old Cartwheel at Brookhouse. I've had some lovely meals there because I don't live far from there. And they'd had a nice meal and they'd set off walking. And he'd suffered horrendous stab wounds as a result of this attack that had happened. And in fact, what we need is the weapon, if we could have it. We need the knife. And actually about 2 hours later, a guy walking his dog, thank goodness for people walking dogs because they solve so many crimes. He rang in to say, I've just seen some lads, young men, throw something in the river. That is the actual place that it went in the river in Rotherham. But we're talking several miles apart, but as the team get together, they say, well, he's been stabbed, Richard's been stabbed, and I'm sure he's dead. We've got a murder. That's gone in there. Soon it gets to first light, let's get the divers out, the police divers. So they go in the river and they don't find anything. So the detective inspector called Bob Vary, who used to live near me, said, I'm not happy with that. Let's get the bloke out with his dog. And he was some considerable distance. He wasn't at the side of the river. He was several hundred yards away. And he actually took and pointed to where he saw the bag go in. So the divers, we're not talking crystal clear blue water. We're talking it's pitch black, this water. He went back in again, the divers went in, and they brought a carrier bag up, plastic bag, it got a knife in it. So that's what we've got. Okay then, that's the exam. Who's done it? That's the title of the talk, who's done it? Any thoughts? Who's your suspect going to be? The wife. So what do you want to know about the wife then? Mobile phone, perhaps? Okay, we'll have a look at the mobile phone. And all there is members of the family and a taxi company, because she doesn't drive. She uses taxis regularly, so we've got the taxi number. And she's protesting. I mean, she's the widow, and she's upset. Do we want to know a bit more about Richard? It's called victimology, because sometimes if you do a victimology, it actually brings evidence. So we start to talk to Richard's family, and she's saying, Pat, we loved each other, and I idolised him. Richard's friends and family said they hated each other. The only reason he used to go home when he came home off ship was to see their 13-year-old daughter. But why did she go out from Italy? It was her idea. And what we can't understand is her walking. She never walks anywhere. She always has a taxi. So they said to her, this time she's not been arrested because, of course, if we arrest her, the custody clock starts ticking. And because it's murder, we've 96 hours to prove it. And if we don't prove it within the 96 hours, she walks, unless we get absolutely incredible new evidence. We've got 96 hours. So we don't think we've got enough to lock her up at this point. But I'm from Yorkshire, and people from England will realise people from Yorkshire are very careful with their money. They call them tight, in the term in England. So they actually went to the factory where Pat worked. And they made some inquiries there to get background information. And the shop steward, the female shop steward in the factory said, well, has she done it then? And we said, why? Well, we're not having a collection if she's done it. So they started to produce evidence that we got a bit uncomfortable with Pat, so we brought her in. She was arrested, so the clock's ticking. We're starting to eat into the 96 hours. And she no commented, which is her legal right to do, where solicitor tells her to no comment. And other than a feeling, with no forensic evidence, with no CCTV because it's a country lane, the forensic of the knife has got his blood on it, but no other evidence. We've no eyewitnesses to it. We've no Goodles, unfortunately, not going down the road at the time, so we've nothing at all. So we release her. But those hours come off the 96-hour total. Then we said, you know, a lot of calls to this taxi firm. Any thoughts? Taxi firm? She's a regular customer of this taxi firm. Could she be having an affair with the taxi driver, do we think? Could be. Well, she is. And his mate is an insurance broker. And guess what? Guess who'd taken the new life insurance out? Do you think we might have got a motive now? We might have got several motives. That actually, she's having an affair with a taxi driver. She's just reinsured him. They actually hate each other. Do we think she could have done it? Or she's got the guys to do it? Well, we bring her back in and we lay all this evidence out in front of her. She goes, no, I ain't done it. Not me. So we make the decision to arrest the taxi driver we think is the boyfriend. We arrest the insurance broker, and they roll over and say, yeah, we did it. So we bring Julie back in again, and Julie says, not me. I didn't do it. All you've got is circumstantial. They're lying. They might have killed him, but they've made it up to get me in bother. So we didn't get Goodle car down the street, but there was a young lad who'd escaped from prison about 3 months before, and he got arrested. And when he was brought in, he says, if I tell you something that might be useful, would it help? And we said, what do you mean? He says, well, the other early hours, the other Sunday morning, I was laid in a hedge bottom, not far from the old cartwheel at Brookhouse, and you'll never guess what. These two blokes were waiting on this lane, and this man and woman came down, and she knew the blokes, and they killed him, and I saw it, but I didn't come forward because I'd escaped from prison and I'd got locked up. So we invite Julie back in, and we say, bad luck, Julie. Somebody's young lad was in the hedge bottom, and he saw you talking to the murderers, and so you must have done it. She goes, I didn't do it. It's not me. I was there, but I was talking to him. I haven't killed my husband. I wasn't involved in it at all. So I was in the... We decided that we were going to charge her with the murder. We thought we'd got enough circumstantial for it to get a successful conviction. We were at 95 hours and 40 minutes. So we've got to charge her or let her walk. So we brought her to the charge desk. Imagine something about 12 foot long. There's a sergeant behind it. There's one of the detectives, constables who've been dealing with the interview. And they get the charge sheet. You've seen it on TV. He's going to read out the charge. And the psychological effect of standing there and realising that she was going to get charged, she goes, all right, I'll tell you, I've done it. We've got 20 minutes to get a tape recorder set up and interview it, and she admitted that she'd done it. There is a postscript to this, conscious of time. It's about 3 years later, a colleague of mine went on for a weekend to York, very historic city in the north of England, and he checked into the hotel, and he checked in and he thought, on reception, that face seems familiar. And it's one of those, he'd be no good as a witness, identification witness, because immediately he can't think who it is. Then later that night, that's Pat, that's the one that committed the murder. And she's working on a hotel reception desk. And we found out that the prison released her on day release after 3 years to work on the hotel reception desk, together with other prisoners that were actually working as chambermaids in the hotel. We chose not to use that hotel again. So I do know that you've probably solved it. I know you weren't going to shout the answers out, but I hope that you did manage to get the clue. And you did. I have to say that women tend to be a lot better. My wife, late wife, used to be on the murder team. I would more have women detectives because they've a more intuition, particularly in domestic murders like that. So I think I can say, you've all passed. And that's the end. And I'll see you on Friday. And my presentation on Friday is called A Tale of Three Rippers, and it'll be about Jack the Ripper from Victorian England. It'll be about the Blackout Ripper, who was a man that committed horrendous crimes during the blackout in London in the 1940s, and it'll be a lot about the Yorkshire Ripper that committed offences in Yorkshire in 75 to 81. Thank you very much indeed.
15 minutes too late. 15 minutes too late.
Oh, sorry, I thought I was.